Good morning. Yesterday I spoke briefly about NHS in the current crisis the country faces, and I spoke briefly about VE Day and the end of hostilities within Europe at the end of the Second World War. I spoke to you about my grandfather, and all of us of a certain generation had grandfathers that fought in the Second World War. So for today, I've got something slightly different for you, in as much as I am not going to lead the assembly as such, but I'm going to hand over to Mr. Philp, who, believe it or not, and I know you'll find this hard to believe, is younger than me, but also had a grandfather who fought in the Second World War, and he's going to tell you a little bit about his story and VE Day.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, but in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. The German war is therefore at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
That was how VE Day started. The 8th of May, 1945, the day that we'll be celebrating tomorrow. We've had a bank holiday mood for it because it is 75 years on. Let's see a little bit more of those celebrations.
After the King and Queen had made their final appearance, the crowd streamed to Piccadilly Circus. The two royal princesses were in amongst the throng. Escorted by guards officers, they slipped out of the palace by a side door to join the fun. The licensing laws were suspended for the night. Everyone in uniform was a hero. Fireworks and floodlights, not seen for years, were timely reminders of what peace could be like.
As Mr. Little said, people of my generation all have a grandad that did something in the war. And one of my granddads, Bill Hughes, wrote this diary. Now, I don't know much about my grandad, or rather, I didn't know much about him until I started reading this diary. My grandad died when I was 8. And as an 8-year-old, all I knew about the Second World War was what I was reading in comics. And there were some comics around at that time, Commando and Warlord, which I got all my information from about the Second World War. And it was rather one-sided, I have to say. But also, I didn't know much about the Second World War because my grandad, as I suspect many people of his age, didn't like to speak about what happened in the war. And it's only till I've read this that I've started to understand why. So this year, from the 23rd of January, I've been trying to read one of these each day and translate it, one of these entries each day and translate it so that I can understand a bit more about his journey, exactly 75 years on. Okay, so I have here a page of his writing. You can see it's quite tiny. This would have been a diary that he'd have carried around in his uniform, maybe in a top pocket or something like that, and then he could have written in it whenever something came to him. And you know what? His experiences on the front line in the Second World War are not too different from ours as we battle this coronavirus crisis that's going on at the moment. For example, he was surprised by the state of the shops. He'd come from a country, Great Britain, where everything was rationed. It was very difficult to get hold of basic food, let alone fancy equipment. But when he got to Belgium, which had just been liberated and so was free, he found this. 3rd of February. Went to Bruges, shops full, but very dear. Bought scents, cosmetics, People well dressed and clean, wonderful complexions. So he made a note about how good the people looked. Maybe they'd had time to actually buy some makeup, whereas the people still fighting the war couldn't even get to the shops to get their makeup. But of course, real action happened as well. My granddad was stationed as part of a balloon unit. Now, he wasn't a clown or anything. What he had to do was he had to put these huge barrage balloons up in the sky on big steel ropes full of hydrogen. These days, the balloons that you get at parties have helium. Hydrogen is terribly explosive, and if enemy planes flew by, the idea was they'd hit one of the balloons and blow up, and it was a way of defending the places that they were winning in the battle. Now for us, the word duty is a bit funny, isn't it? But for my granddad, it was anything but funny. Because a doody was short for doodlebug, and a doodlebug was the nickname of the V1 flying rocket, the vengeance weapons that the Germans were using to attack British and Allied troops. They were a rocket that was fired, and then when the engines cut out, it would just fall down and blow up. Here's his entry about a doody. 9th of 10th of March, greatest scare yet. At dawn on operations, saw doody coming down. All of us made dive for dike, certain that this was it. But it fell some distance away, all badly nerved. Many doodies shot down, big barrage now. Doodies falling all around sites. One on nearby farm, killing lady. So, those doodlebug flying bombs were a terrible threat to the Allied forces. And so the war went on through March and into April. And in April, my granddad was then posted into Germany itself, because at that time in the Second World War, the Allied forces were advancing very rapidly. But the tone of his diary changes quite a bit at this point. 9th of April. Scandalous behaviour of officers. They like this life, and outsiders come for 2-day visits in rota from Antwerp and St. Nicholas to loot, look around and say they have visited Germany. 10th of April. Returned refugees trying to repair their houses and of what little stuff is left. What a job. I think my granddad was starting to look forward to the end of the war when peace came, and he realised that if people were looting now and taking whatever they wanted, it would make it much harder for people to forgive each other after the war. But for me it gets worse. Because on VE Day, when lots of people were celebrating, my granddad didn't really enjoy that day. Because he saw something that day that made him very sad. Okay, it's something to really think about. 7th to the 9th of May. V-Day. St. Nick, full of excited drinking people. Flags, dancing cafes full. Civvies relieved. Not so us. Much damage caused by underground movements, burning and destroying property of collaborators. No police action, and watched by crowds. Very puzzling of me to see such fine property destroyed. Foresee much trouble in Belgium between these parties, excuse for looting, etc. So, my granddad was concerned that people weren't in a place to forgive each other for what had happened in the Second World War, and that the problems that went on in the Second World War would carry on afterwards. Now, we're not quite in the same situation now, but we are in the situation where lots of us have got different experiences of this lockdown. Some people are working really hard, and in the NHS working really hard and seeing terrible things. Some people are really bored and frustrated. And at the end of that, we kind of need to be in a position where we can forgive each other and move on and be positive about what we've each done. We need to be in a position where we don't hold on to any bitterness and get ready for the future. And as we celebrate VE Day tomorrow, I hope that we'll think about the VC Day that might one day come, victory over coronavirus. And I hope on that day there'll be none of the kind of things that my granddad saw, where people are holding it against each other for what they did, but rather people are being positive about the contributions that we've all made and that we can go on and make a better future. Let's do that today. Let's work hard and enjoy the celebrations tomorrow.